I'm a former visa officer, and if you've overstayed your visa in the US, it's going to play a big role in whether or not you can get your visa issued again in the future. Okay? Overstaying is seen by the visa officers as very serious. Their entire reason for doing the visa interviews is trying to prevent people from staying in the US after their purpose of travel has finished. They're trying to identify people who will remain in the US more time than they're supposed to. Okay, that includes tourists, that includes students, that includes everybody. Okay, so if you've stayed in the US longer than the expected amount of time, this is something that's going to be a huge red flag for them. And you're really going to need to be prepared to explain the situation to them in the interview so that they don't feel like you've committed a violation, an immigration violation. Now, let's get into some technicalities. An overstay, what is an overstay? How do you know if you've overstayed? Well, when you're admitted into the US, you'll either have a certain number of days that you've been admitted for, like for a tourist visa, it's usually 180 days, 6 months, but they can issue it for a different amount of time. Usually that would mean less, right? If they're suspicious about your purpose of travel, they might give you 3 weeks in order to attend your business meetings and then depart. There is the possibility that they could issue a longer status. This doesn't happen a lot, but in the regulations, it does say that they are authorized to issue a longer stay to someone for certain purposes of travel, okay? Now, if you stay past that certain number of days that you're given, you're considered out of status. Now, being out of status doesn't necessarily just mean automatically, okay, now you're banned from getting a visa again to enter the US, but it is a red flag. In fact, there's no actual penalty until you've been in the US over 180 days past the date that you were supposed to depart. So if you were admitted to the US for 6 months as a tourist and you stayed for 8 months, you don't have a ban, right? Because you would have had to stay for 6 months extra in order to get the ban. But just because you don't have the ban, and if you go to an attorney, they may assess this and say, yeah, you don't have a ban, but the visa officers are not just adjudicating based on the technicalities of the law, of the Foreign Affairs Manual, of this amount of days equals this ineligibility. No, they have to make a judgment call as well. So they take that 8-month stay into account when they're making their judgment call about what you might do in the future, okay? Now here's the other part. This is the part that I don't like, and you're not gonna like it either. They might say 6 months, right? 6 months is the standard for everyone that enters the US on a B1, B2 visa, a tourist visa. But if you stay for 5 months and a half, the visa officers are going to look at that just as negatively as a 6-month and 1 week stay, right? That's technically an overstay. They're going to look at that 5.5 month stay just as negatively. Because really, 3 months difference out of 6 months, the marginal increase in the number of days you've stayed isn't that much. And they were going to look at that and think, okay, well, what was someone doing there for this long period of time? Basically, in their mind, they're thinking, okay, short-term travel for tourism versus long-term travel for what else, right? If you're of working age, standard working age, what they would consider to be someone in the height of their career who's going to be working mostly full-time, who has gone to the US for tourism and has stayed there for 5.5 months, they're going to think, okay, well, what were you doing in the US, okay? There are legitimate reasons. People go on gap years for tourism, right? But if you're going to claim that you went to the US and you were a tourist for that amount of time, you better be prepared to present a lot of evidence that shows them, here's the tourism that I was doing, right? I've suggested to people that they use Instagram, right? Look at all these Instagram photos that I took. I was all over the US. I was visiting national parks, visiting friends in different cities, right? That shows tourism. If you don't have any of this evidence, and you say, yeah, I was just staying in Springfield, Illinois the entire time with my cousin for 5.5 months, which is not the technical overstay, or for 8 months, right? And you say it was just tourism, they're not likely going to believe you because they're going to think you're of working age, no one goes and stays in one town for 6 months just for tourism, and they're going to think that you are working without authorization, okay? Now, let's say you're a student. Students can also be out of status. It's harder to be technically out of status as a student because students and some other visa types are admitted to the US duration of status, which means that as long as you're in status, your visa is valid, right? That means that there's not a specific number of days that you can stay, but as long as you're a student, you can stay in the US. Also, This has gone back and forth over the years, but currently you actually can't be accruing unlawful presence in the US if you're admitted on an F visa for duration of status, unless an immigration judge makes a ruling against you. So, this is really into the technicalities, but as a student, they should not be saying that you have any bans on you because of overstay, because you were admitted duration of status. But let's talk about the visa interview. How does that affect you in the visa interview? Like we said before, it's not all about the law. It's about their judgment call. So even if you didn't accrue any unlawful presence, they still will interpret your stay under this entire rubric of trying to make sure that people aren't going to stay in the US longer than their intended stay. All right. So when you go into the visa interview, if you do have an overstay, the key is that you need to know exactly how long your overstay might be, right? And exactly how you're going to present it to the visa officer to make sure they don't have any doubts or concerns or suspicions about what you might do in the future. This is different in every single situation. During COVID, there were a lot of people that were unable to depart the US because of COVID, because of the travel restrictions, because of lack of availability of flights, sometimes just because the flights were way too expensive. They were 10 times their normal price in order to get home, and many people decided to wait it out. Very understandably. In fact, many of the visa officers were stranded in places where they just had to wait it out. But guess what? It's been 2 years since the height of that situation and the inability to travel, and the memory starts to fade, and they're being less and less lenient and less merciful about those situations. Many of my clients have gone in and they've had problems when they've stayed in the US during COVID. They're being held responsible for these overstays as if the officers have forgotten what the general climate and atmosphere was back then, okay? So you have to be prepared. What I suggest you do is figure out what exactly this is going to entail in your interview by having a consultation with a former visa officer. Click the link in our caption, go to our website. You want to get a consultation with someone who was a visa officer, most preferably in your country, speaking your language, an expert in your visa type, and they're going to be able to help you. We are pass your visa interview, okay? Click that link, get a personalized consultation. That's how you're going to pass your visa interview.